So for our last technique, we're going to use mica powders in a distressed background. And it's a great way to add just a bit of a shimmer to that background. And it's very easy to do. So, works best if you do it on a mat. It doesn't work as well to do the distressed background onto glass. The ink just reacts a little bit different. By doing it on a mat, it tends to bead up a little bit more and you tend to get more of that texture to it. So I'm actually using two different colors. You don't need to use two different colors. I'm using turquoise and pewter. You can absolutely use just one. I just like the way it looked with two. So I'm putting a little bit down and you can see that I tapped my straw here to get little bits all around. I didn't want to have one pile of it in one area, because if you do that, then you tend to get a bit of a blob in one area on your background. So let's move that to the side. Next, we're going to use a spray bottle and we're going to put some water on it. And we want to see a bunch of those drops. I've got some mixed media paper here. This is paper that can handle the water. You definitely need to use mixed media paper with it, not regular cardstock, because it's going to react completely different. Cardstock is just going to bubble and blister under the paper, whereas mixed media can handle the water. It is going to curve a little bit, but that's totally fine. So I've got a heat it tool here. This is a little bit more gentle than a heat gun. So it does emit some heat, but it's more for drying paints than it is for embossing. You could use this to emboss, but because it's a gentler heat, it takes a little bit longer. So I'm using my heat tool to dry that ink, and it doesn't need to be 100% dry. 80% dry is good. I just don't want to have pools of water anywhere. So if there's anywhere, and there's one right there, that's why I'm concentrating right here. If there's any pools of water, I'm going to use my heat gun in that area to dry that up as much as possible. Once that's done, what we're going to do, and that's a little bit too wet, I should dry it a little bit more, but that's okay because it's on the edge. What we're going to do is we're going to tap it in the remaining drips, and that's going to add some splotches and splatters, and then we're going to dry it again. So you can continue this for as many times as you want. Typically, I tend to do it about 3 times. Sometimes when I'm doing it, it just doesn't have enough of the splatters or the texture that I like, so I tend to do it a little bit more. It's a personal preference thing. You'll kind of know after playing around with this technique a little bit when it's done for you. And because this background is quite busy, I left the stamped part of it quite simple. So I've just got some flower stamps that I stamped and embossed, and then just a simple sentiment that was stamped and embossed in the same color. So I didn't want it to compete with the background. You could put a die cut over top of this as well. I chose not to, just because we have another card that has a die cut over top of it, so I chose just to do a stamped image. So I need to get those puddles there dry first. If it gets a little bit too dark, you could take a paper towel and you can mop up some of the excess moisture. Sometimes it's like watching paint dry and it doesn't dry fast enough for you. There we go. Now we're going to tap it in those blobs again. And I tend to focus on some of the smaller areas rather than the bigger blobs. And then you can look at it and see if there's this area that's missing, and you can do another splotch on that as well. So I think I'm liking the texture to it. So once this is dry, I'm good with it. We're going to move on to the next step. For this part, to move on to the next step, it needs to be 100% dry. If there's any part of this that's not completely dry before we still go to the stamping and embossing, that embossing powder is going to stick to whatever's wet. So we need to make sure it's absolutely dry before we move on to that. All right, we're good to go. I'm going to clean this up. Where did my paper towel? I thought I had a half-used one here, but apparently not. There we go. Just make sure that we don't have any wet areas that we can accidentally put something in. All right, so it does curl up a little bit, but once we go and glue it back to our card, it's gonna flatten right out. So I'm gonna use some liquid platinum embossing powder. I use the piece of paper that we've been using with our pearls, just wipe it off a little bit so there's not as much pearl left on there. Now, if you feel more comfortable, you can stamp and emboss individual flowers. I decided to just go for it and stamp a bunch of them at the same time. I can kind of see faintly where my ink is, and because of that I can choose where to put the next stamp. But like I said, if you're more comfortable doing individual stamping and embossing, you can absolutely do that. There we go. Let's put our powder on. Tap the excess off, and then let's put the powder back in the container. And like I said, I could use that heat tool to emboss as well, but it's just going to take a little bit longer, so I'm going to use my heat gun. So now you can see right on that background there's little pockets of mica. So it doesn't put the mica over the entire thing, it just puts little pockets of it, which is what I love about it. It makes it more interesting, in my opinion. So now I'm going to take a dauber and the darker of the two blues, and I'm just going to ink the edges just to frame it a little bit before gluing it onto my card base. And you could, if you wanted, ink it with a different color to frame it a little bit more. I just chose to be a little bit more monochromatic with it and stick with the colors that were used in the background. And there we go. And once again, because from the water technique the paper is a little bit curled, I'm going to just put a block on it to weigh it down while it dries. But there you go. Another way to use mica powder. So in the next video, we're not actually going to do a technique, but I'm just going to show you a few other ways that mica powders can be used, just so you know that that's another use for them. We'll see you there.